Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar on expanding in the US, strategic insights for European companies. Today's discussion is about helping European companies understand not just why the US remains attractive, but also how to navigate a more complex policy, trade, and investment environment. We will move from macro trends to trade and tariffs, to location strategy, and finally to execution. My name is Marcel Schultz. I'm the director of EACC Netherlands. And with me today are two highly rated member firms of the EACC, Global Location Strategies and Becker Lawyers. Let me first briefly introduce those firms before diving into the topic. When an industrial operator makes a strategic North American locations decision, it's not about real estate. It's a long-term bet on cost, risk exposure, and operational fit. Global Location Strategies brings a senior-led process that tests every critical variable before capital is committed, so you can stand behind the decision with confidence and lead your company to a place it can thrive for decades. Nicolette Ross is the managing consultant of Global Location Strategies Europe office and joins us today from Amsterdam. Welcome, Nicolette.
Thank you.
Becker is a US and European-based commercial law firm with offices in key markets including Washington, DC, New York, Florida, and Milan. The firm combines legal expertise with government relations, advising companies on market entry, regulatory strategy, and complex business operations. For European companies expanding into the US, Becker brings practical on-the-ground insight into navigating trade policy and the evolving regulatory landscape, helping translate strategy into execution. Welcome, Gabriel and Amanda.
Thank you.
Hey, pleasure. Welcome.
So we will be discussing four main themes today around US business expansion, current trends, what's happening with trade, translating strategy in geography, and project execution. And we encourage our audience to ask your questions via the Q&A. I will keep my eye out for your input. And we already have received some questions via the registration form, and they have been included in our outline. So let's begin with a broader picture. Despite the geopolitical uncertainty, shifting trade dynamics, oil prices going up, and the rising policy complexity, the US seems to continue to attract major investment. I'd like to start by unpacking what's driving that resilience and what trends companies should be paying attention to right now. And my first question, maybe to Gabe, to start with you. From your perspective, what explains the resilience of the US economy and investment climate at this moment?
Well, thanks, Marcel. That's a great question, and it's amazed me in the last 4 or 5 years since pre-COVID, COVID, then change in administrations, inflation tensions, and now the war in Iran. How this U.S. economy has up to now hold its muster, in a sense that the figures that we see, in the labor market, in the CPI, in the consumer price index, that's inflation, in the monetary and fiscal responses, for now continue to show, a pretty deep resilience. Obviously, the current situation in Iran with the price of oil increasing, some indicators I was just reading before joining this webinar, Wall Street Journal article saying potential recession at $140, $150 per barrel. We're just shy of 100, so there's a very substantial way to get to that type of cost for oil. But that said, the U.S. is showing a resilient labor market. Consumer spending and inflation that the Fed has been trying to battle now for 1.5 years or so didn't explode as we all expected, maybe, or at least a lot of market participants thought that would happen in January after the Liberation Day tariffs. innovation and productivity, also driven by all the AI investments, has driven the U.S. to a pretty resilient economy for now.
And do you see? Which sectors or business fundamentals continue to make the U.S. compelling for European investors? What do you see?
Well, the Europeans have a lot of space to grow in the United States, from traditional industries like agriculture, ag, to innovative technologies, where also their startup ecosystem is such that there's a lot of talent, but the funding opportunities are complicated, but growth can occur in the United States. So I think there are a lot of sectors, but for sure everything that is technology oriented, but some also traditional sectors like agtech, agriculture, and consumer retail we see that happening. Obviously, we see a shift since the Liberation Day tariffs, and we can talk a little bit later about all that, of shifting to manufacturing and producing and direct servicing in the United States, with a structure which is less, a business model which is less global and more global, as I said. So global and local, where you are closer to your local demand.
All right. Yeah, and I think I've heard you saying that before in other seminars as well. Let's move to Amanda. Build America, Buy America was enacted in 2021, I believe, as part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. How is this still influencing market access and localization strategies for foreign companies?
Oh, wow. I think, and everyone, I am based in DC, and my background is Capitol Hill. So really what I'm doing every day is working with the White House, with federal agencies, with Congress. And I think there are impressions that there's a lot of division in the United States, and on some things there certainly is. But on Build America, Buy America, there has been such consistent and widespread consensus. It's a bipartisan initiative. It's not going anywhere. And this administration in particular is looking for ways to incentivize manufacturing in the United States. So it is an issue of market access. A lot of federally funded projects in the United States, and we do a lot of federal funding in the United States for major infrastructure projects and for purchases, are conditional on U.S. content. So, from the standpoint of European manufacturers who may be selling into the United States, yes, it may feel like a barrier. But what I would urge you to note is that it's really an opportunity in a lot of ways, and a huge advantage for firms that localize in the United States early. So, Build America, Buy America is going nowhere at all. It actually existed prior to 2021 and was greatly expanded in the context of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And it should be part of your calculus as you think about investing in the United States. Now, there's a little bit of a stick, but there's also a carrot for sure. And that's in the form of huge United States incentives. I take clients into the White House and help them tell the story of how they have made the decision to invest in the United States. And the reaction we get from the folks there is, that's fantastic. What else can we do to break down every barrier to your investment in the United States? So just know that is how the US government, from Congress to federal agencies to the White House on a bipartisan basis, is really approaching this today.
All right, thank you. Nicolette, moving over to you, as the US still continues to rank as a top destination for FDI, what does that tell us about investor confidence? Do you see any macro trends and on a company level considerations that are shaping investment decisions today?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The US continues to be one of the most attractive markets for investments globally. And when we were looking at some of the data provided by FDI Markets, it shows that more than half of the investments from Europe are being concentrated within the US. And so what I think that shows is that European investors do still have confidence in the foundation of what the US market has to offer. So, yes, there's a lot of different factors right now at play that have to be taken into consideration, but the facts of the market itself have not substantially changed when it comes to thinking about the size of the consumer market, the entrepreneurial culture that can be advantageous when it comes to innovation or funding access. There tends to be less regulatory red tape within the US when compared to other markets. And then the workforce as well is quite skilled, and there are structures in place for upskilling. And so when I'm thinking about a little bit of the macro trends that have been going on, one thing that I have noticed is that there's been a change or an evolution of the why behind some of these different expansions. And so for many Europeans, as you all may know, the expansion into the US used to be primarily about just a market expansion in general. But now what we're seeing is that it's becoming more and more about strategic positioning. So when we think about some of the different, the older models for evaluation of the market, they typically solve for market access, cost advantages, and logistics. Now, newer models are solving for these same things, but they're also solving for supply chain resiliency, or to Amanda's point, the federal industrial policies, whether that be the economic incentives or considerations around the domestic content, access to innovation, and then cost, of course, is still being looked at as a whole as well.
All right, yeah, I've heard that before, indeed. So the headline seems to be that the US still remains highly attractive, but the conditions for entering and succeeding are becoming maybe a little bit more specific and more strategic. So we have 4 topics to cover. So let's turn to trade. For many companies, the question is no longer simply whether the US market is attractive, but whether the policy environment makes entry or expansion more complicated or more costly, and in more cases, maybe some more urgent. Gabe, to you, what are the most important trade policy developments, or Amanda, maybe, a company should be watching right now?
Yeah, maybe, Amanda deals with all the federal government relations and federal funding. We are on the legal side of the firm that does all the FDI legal structuring. For sure, tariffs is a major issue. And maybe Amanda, you can talk a little bit more about where we are now.
Sure.
But from my end, in terms of the tariffs, depending on the sectors, whether you are in steel and copper and those types of sectors, you obviously have to think strategically. But for generally speaking, it's a key issue that it's now being pretty much digested in the supply chain. But I'll let Amanda give you the latest and greatest on what's happening at the Hill, and then I can talk a little bit about legal strategies.
Sure. I'll give you just to catch everybody up. So 1 month ago, on February 20th, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that most of President Trump's tariff regime was unconstitutional, saying he didn't have the authority to impose these tariffs using the justification that he had. So then the litigation, and I'm not an attorney, so Gabe may want to go into this a bit more, moved to the U.S. Court of International Trade. And the U.S. Court of International Trade ordered the government to begin implementing a refund process. The government came back to the U.S. Court of Trade and said, hey, this is a little complicated, guys. We need some time. And they've been granted that time to develop the refund process, trying to find ways to avoid thousands of individual refund proceedings, and then coordinating all this with U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So right now, the Court of International Trade is satisfied that this administration is moving forward, though not as quickly as we would probably want. The president, not one to be stopped by the courts, quickly implemented another tariff under another justification that that a president of the United States has never done before. So this was one of our favorite words that we like using here in DC, unprecedented. We have a lot of unprecedented things happening. And those are only able to stay in place for a period of 120 days before Congress has to weigh in and allow them to be extended or or halt them. So we have a lot of moving pieces here, I think we are providing a lot of legal but also advocacy advice to our clients, and a lot of that is good record keeping. Knowing your HTS classifications for everything and preparing refund documentation. We're also working really closely with congressional champions because I would say that Congress does not have on a bipartisan basis, Congress does not have the appetite for tariffs that President Trump does. Right now, I don't think Congress is in a position, perhaps to overturn some of these. But that could all change in November when we have some major elections. I know we're going to talk about that later, but that sort of
Yeah.
sets the stage for maybe Gabe, you can talk a little bit about, how
Yeah,
to set yourself up legally to make sure that you're in the best possible position.
yeah. Currently now, we see two things happening. Obviously, there's been a fury of legal activity. I think over some people are reporting 2,200 cases that were initiated. The CIT, the Court of International Trade, has taken on the role of the center court for this type of issue, and has been very clear, as you said, Amanda, on the refund process. Now it's just a question for CBP, which is the U.S. Customs, to put in place changes to its electronic method. It's called ACE, in order to be able to process what's probably 160, 170 billion USD on tariff refunds. So a lot of our clients our European clients have not opted for litigation right now, although you could attach yourself to one of the existing cases going on, and are getting ready for what's called a protest, which is just a method of seeking a refund from U.S. Customs when that automated system will be put in place, which is not too long. The CIT had mandated a 45-day process a couple of weeks ago now, I think, and the CBP and the Treasury are working on getting that in place. There, it's obviously very important to the record keeping and the analyzing whether the importer of record, because tariffs are actually an issue for the importer of record, not the European seller in the US. So the record keeping is very important to understand whether the importer of record has an ACE account set up and is tied to a US bank. Refunds are via ACH wire transfers. So all those mechanical steps prior to initiating a protest refund claim are being put in place. But if I can, that is not changing the overall dynamics, I think, of the strategic thinking from at least what we see from our clients, which are a mix of traditional industry, manufacturing, and technology, that they're rethinking their strategy in the United States, and deciding to a certain degree accelerate their global structure, as I said before. Mm-hmm. So setting up operations in the United States, which in the future, regardless of if it's a US, European, or any other world issue, would kind of shield them from these market changes and be able to service their client, the consumer base locally.
So if you think a little, if you want to plan a little bit further into the future in the upcoming years, do you think it will be a kind of a temporary disruption, or is it something more structural? Or will it ever go away? What is your expectation on that?
Do you want to talk about that, Amanda, from a political point of view?
From a political point of view, I think it will depend a great deal on our upcoming elections. So we have just a few months until the midterm congressional elections. Right now, we have one political party in charge of the White House, the House and the Senate. that typically does not last for long. So I think we will see a pendulum swing and the ability for Congress to exert a little more influence over this process. So I think we could see some changes in the coming months. But during this administration, I have very little doubt that the president will continue to try to put pressure and exert influence in this way through the use of tariffs. So it's this is not a short-term issue, and certainly something you all need to be planning for in the coming years.
Yeah, and then if I can jump in very quickly, putting into context, we're talking about, for example, the 122 tariffs that Amanda was alluding to that replaced the IEPA now that it's unconstitutional, and that will require at the end of the 120 days a congressional review. We're talking about 10% up to 15%. Currently, it's at 10. So based on our review of the situation and the commercial agreements and the supply chain arrangements that we see cross-border between the Europe and the US, these have been absorbed to a certain degree by the whole supply chain. And different story for certain key industries, as I said, like steel, copper, and which are subject to higher tariffs. But if we're generalizing, I think a lot of that has been absorbed. Now, obviously, our clients are keen to initiate a refund process if at all possible.
Are you supporting them in that?
Yeah, absolutely. With our custom colleagues and obviously our DC Capitol Hill colleagues in the government relations side.
Okay, let's include Nicolette as well. Nicolette, at the pre-site selection stage, how do you consider the trade and tariff situation to affect the overall feasibility of a U.S. investment?
Yeah, we're kind of viewing this from two different lenses because certainly to Gabe and Amanda's point, there's a lot of changes around the trade policies and the different tariffs that are involved. And so from one viewpoint, if you are going through the process of still determining the overall business case for the US, then certainly factoring in the different scenarios is going to be key to understand what that business case looks like. So, I mean, when you're doing your feasibility analysis of do you continue an export strategy, for instance, or do you physically locate within the US, I would model out some of these different percentages to see how they impact the overall business case. But if you as a company have already decided that there is a need to be within the US, then to Gabe's point, it's more about figuring out your strategy local because the tariffs and those trade policies are not going to impact the specific site location that will ultimately drive your long-term success within the US. So it has to be, yes, a part of the equation, but if you're already entering the US and taking those next steps, then you have to start to consider beyond just the federal landscape. Once you get past that, it's comparing the states and then comparing at the local level, because some of those different cost inputs at the local level are going to drive whether or not you can be successful in the long term from a cost standpoint as well. So it's more about layering on all of these different risk factors to strategize within the U.S. market what makes the most sense from my business and operational fit.
And do you see companies delaying decisions due to uncertainty or accelerating to lock in positions? Do you see both maybe?
I think we're seeing a mix of both. Certainly, Gabe, I know we've had a discussion around this in some of our different discussions, but there seems to be some that are taking kind of a reactive approach to what's going on. They have already had plans to go into the U.S. market, but this is kind of triggering to move a lot quicker. But then there are some companies that have taken a little bit of pause, not a full cancellation per se, but just to re-strategize and figure out I like the term Gabe used, global situation to see how they can optimize their supply chain and create some resiliency around the overall strategy.
And maybe a question for Amanda: is there still a risk, you think, between the US and the EU, a risk of escalation that businesses should prepare for? I mean, there is a lot going on in the world, so it's not only about tariffs, I know, but
Right.
but since we are speaking about that, what is your view?
I am feeling less risk today. I am feeling less risk and less volatility for sure. I think we have a lot of issues going on in this country that Congress and the White House are also dealing with. We have appropriations bills that haven't passed, a Department of Homeland Security that's completely unfunded. We have debt ceiling. So I do sense sort of a little bit more of inward activity. Um, Certainly, border issues in this country are huge. So I think that, we're going to continue to be watching things very closely and working to impact them, but I see less volatility moving forward.
If I can jump in also, Marcel, I also see that the European administrations at each member state level, but also at the Brussels level, have kind of like come to understand better this administration through the last 12 months. So I think and we see that with what's happened now also with the Iran, right? Which it's affecting probably way more Europe and China than the United States because the US is energy independent. And most of the LNG gas comes from Qatar into Europe. So I see a lot of more skilled approach in being able to interact with this current administration.
Okay, I think we can talk for hours about it, and we will probably not come to conclusive solutions. So let's move on to turning strategy into geography. Many companies begin with a broad conviction that they need a US presence, but the real complexity probably begins when they have to determine where, why, and under what operating assumptions. So let's talk about that a little bit. Nicolette, what factors have changed most in the recent years when companies identify potential US regions or states?
Yeah, the three main things come immediately to mind. The first one, absolutely energy. Energy is now really a strategic advantage for different locations. There is certainly infrastructure constraints, grid capacity that has raised some concerns for different areas. And so for a lot of projects, energy availability and the feasibility of scaling up when needed is driving the overall site selection process and where companies start to focus their initial searches. So certainly something to keep in mind. It's navigable, yes, but it has to be factored in when you're thinking about your timeline and getting up to operations. The second one that comes to mind is speed to market, which overlaps a little bit with the energy and ability to scale up. But speed to market, I think, has always been a factor that many companies have sought after. But the concept of speed to market has evolved a little bit. So I feel as if historically, speed to market was really around the construction aspect and the ability to build very quickly. But now speed to market is really thinking about the overall ecosystem that ultimately impacts the ability for the company to get from deciding on a site to generating revenue. So when we're thinking about the speed to market, it's not just building the actual facility, but the permitting timeline, can that go through very easily without any difficulties? Maybe workforce from the raw data says that it's there, but are you going to be able to scale up in the time that you need it? Is there going to be a phased approach that has to be considered? So speed to market has to look beyond just the site itself, and then all of the other factors that would play a role to make those operations work. And then the last one that comes to mind is kind of a surgence around different environmental aspects or compatibility with the community. So making sure from an industrial standpoint, for instance, that the community you go into makes sense and is compatible has always been a part of the puzzle. But a lot of areas are seeing a lot of activity. There's things in the news from data centers that resources are being drained. So this is top of mind for a lot of just everyday citizens. So when they see that there's another project coming in that's going to take up energy or water or whatever the case is, they're not always very welcoming of that. So now, instead of kind of assuming this is an industrial area, it should be a fit, this does have to be placed a little bit more at the beginning of the process to make sure you, before you get too far down the line, you know, is the community going to receive this project well? Or when you start going through some of those different approval processes, are you going to have people that speak up against the project, thus delaying overall, and then, of course, impacting the ability to operate?
Regarding the speed to market, do you see differences between states? I know you can't maybe mention states, that wouldn't be nice, but just to give a glimpse of are there different main differences?
Yeah, I do think so. So there's certainly a number of different states that have programs in place to help make sure that the site itself is kind of ready to go as possible for different investments. So for instance, they have completed different environmental studies on the property already to take out as many question marks as possible. But not everyone has all of the pieces pulled together because, again, it has to be a little bit more than just the site itself. But from an infrastructure standpoint, if it doesn't have the infrastructure that it needs based on the industries that particular community or site is targeting, is there a path forward? Do you have a plan in place? Are the stakeholders ready to kind of implement a realistic strategy on behalf of companies? Do we have a clear understanding around, who is approving the building permits and so forth? So there are some differences, but certainly in some areas, many areas, there is a drive towards making sure there's clear answers around all of these different components.
All right, thank you. And for either Gabe or Amanda, where do companies most often underestimate the complexity in the geography phase? Could you share
maybe I can take that. I mean, when you're structuring an FDI project, obviously the project usually has a corporate component to it, right? So you create a US entity that will be your US operating company. And sometimes a lot of European companies don't understand how the US is structured in that sense. So it's kind of like an analogy to the European Union is 50 different countries. Corporate law is at the state level, not at the federal level. And states constitutionally were set up to kind of compete with each other to a certain degree. And that's why you have things like Select USA, which is this organization that covers all 50 states and allows states to promote themselves. There's a healthy competition between states and trying to attract FDI. From a corporate point of view, where you stick your company, your US entity, it's always a question that comes to bear, and it really depends to a certain degree, in a sense that Delaware is obviously one of those states that still retains a key ranking in terms of the states where most U.S. companies are incorporated. It depends a lot in whether the company has outside investors or it's a wholly owned subsidiary of a European company. But the most important thing is to think that there are 50 different states, 50 different laws. I can be incorporated in Delaware and very easily do business in California, Florida, and Illinois or whatever throughout the United States. So your state of incorporation doesn't limit you from operating on a national basis. You always have to bear in mind tax. It's like as if you are a Dutch company doing business in France. You may have a permanent establishment using a tax reference in France and therefore have to pay French taxes for the operations that you're doing in France. It depends on your setup. So important to put in the to-do list of your FDI project, appropriate corporate legal structuring and choice of state and choice of entity. There are also various different types of entities and models.
Thank you. And maybe for Amanda, at what stage should companies engage with state or local authorities? What is your experience in that?
Oh, very early in the process. And I think they can be great advocates and allies, sort of beyond the incentives that they can offer. They can really be the key to unlocking federal incentives as well. Very often, we're working with companies that are excited to establish new manufacturing capabilities in a community. And we're able to help that community work directly with the U.S. Department of Commerce, for example, to get funding to create a federal partnership where the federal government may put in the roads, may put in the water infrastructure, for example. So, I think as you're looking for partners, you really want to find state and local partners that are open to being really creative in seeking federal resources. And it's never too early to start talking with your member of Congress as well and senators. They really are the key to getting a lot done here in DC. And once you're making the investment in their district or state, you're a constituent. They want to help you. So, really, be mindful of that. It's never too early to have those conversations. They want to do great things for you, bring economic benefit and jobs and infrastructure to their communities, and then want to show it off a little bit and take some credit. So let's help them do that as well.
And from a let's say a more practical standpoint, where does one start? I'm a Dutch company. Okay, I would like to engage with local authorities. Where do I start? With whom? What is your advice on that? Should I hire someone, or can I do that directly?
I mean, you could hire someone, you could do it directly. I think, we say here in the United States, all politics is local. Meet your city council members, meet your county commissioners. They'll be excited to let you know why their site is a great one. And I think it's at that point that you do start having those conversations about partnerships for not only local incentives, but federal incentives as well.
I think also the chambers of commerce are a great
Mhm.
point between Europe and the U.S. They offer. There's a lot of literature out there. There's a lot of information, and sometimes the key is to really be able to digest all that information. But Select USA, and it's obviously a key component that can really help you in which is like that federal organization that collects all the 50 states and does FDI promotion into the United States. They're incredible, and people like Nicolette, GLS, now site selectors that really are so much more than just finding a site, and that it's really key. But there's a lot of resources out there in order to structure FDI between the U.S. and Europe. The key is to go into technical details because because of that, the content that is out there, one could be prone to the idea that you can do it yourself. My only caveat there is if you make mistakes, they're usually costly, and they're very costly in the US, especially legal mistakes, which result in hopefully you guys are not going to ever do that, but litigation or other issues like that.
Yeah. Can I just jump in with one more thing? I think when you are making this outreach, whether it's to a chamber of commerce or to a city council member or to Congress, really getting tight on the messaging is so essential. So it's not just about, hi, we want to move into your community. What can you do for us? It is, here's what we have to offer. Here's why we're excited and think that your community might be the place to do it. How can we work together? So, a lot of, I think people hear lobbyist and there are lots of different impressions about it. But here in the United States, being a lobbyist means being an advocate. It means being a communicator, and it means sort of being a navigator to make sure that whether it's at the local level or the state level, or with me at the federal level, making sure that we're putting together projects where everybody is a winner and really helping to
Mm.
navigate those partnerships. And making it easier for Hill staff to say yes and members of Congress to say yes. Going in there with a reasonable ask, telling your story. So a lot of this is about communications.
Mm.
That's a good
Yeah.
point. Good. Go
Sorry,
ahead, Nicolette.
Marcel, but I think that resonates a lot with me because I feel like when I was on the state side as well, prior to my position with GLS, oftentimes companies did come, asking immediately, what incentives can you provide our company? But Amanda, to your point, it's really important that there is that mutual benefit and leveraging some of those resources that are out there to help build out your story and your messaging and understanding what your impact on the community will be is equally as important throughout the process. Sorry,
Thank you.
Marcel.
No, very good. I'm happy because I'm not sure if this is quite often well addressed in such programs when we talk about US expansion. So it's a very good point. We are often inclined to think about what we want and not to turn the question around and ask what do you want or how can I help you, and then come to basically the same conclusion or ending that you're both helped, and that's a great way. So thank you for that insight. Um, just on this topic, a final question maybe. How are companies rethinking labor and infrastructure incentives and logistics and market access in their location screening process? Are incentives, for instance, becoming less decisive compared to talent and infrastructure? Maybe, Nicolette, you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think incentives when we're thinking through them, from our perspective, they're kind of like the cherry on top. Incentives do not compensate for weak labor pools or regulatory risk or the inability to scale up. So if you are choosing a location solely based on those incentives, you have to keep in mind these are temporary and conditional. So the location you move forward with has to be a fit from an operation standpoint. And when those incentives are taken away, it has to still make sense from a business case as well for you to be able to operate there for the long term. So for us, when thinking about incentives, certainly they are very helpful in the process, but it shouldn't drive the overall strategy of where you start to focus in on.
Understood. Understood. Okay, so let's move on to the fourth topic and the last topic. So once the geography is clear, the challenge becomes, of course, in the execution, how to move from a strategy on paper to a project that actually gets delivered successfully. Because even a strong US market strategy can turn into trouble during execution. So maybe we can move on to the focus on some practical lessons here. What companies tend to get wrong, what they should prepare for early, and how to avoid unnecessary delays in cost. Maybe Gabe, could you share a case study that illustrates what successful execution looks like in practice, or
Yeah, no,
maybe the opposite?
Sure. I'll give you both. I mean, we've seen pretty much. Well, you never stop learning in life, but let's say we've seen a fair bit in nearly 30 years of practice doing cross-border FDI work between Europe and the US. I think from the successful ones are companies that really spend a fair bit of time researching and understanding and organizing their business models. And I'll let Nicolette obviously speak about issues like site selection and workforce and so on and so on. But from the legal point of view, one of the key issues is understanding your commercial arrangements, your supply chain, and your consumer facing B2C or B2B is the same thing. You need to understand how you sell your think carefully about your terms and conditions, how you're doing business with your customers in the United States, what are customary practices, the legal environment. It's not like in Europe, civil law countries, that there's a lot of default law that applies nonetheless, even if you don't have it in a piece of paper. In the US, the contract is king. If you have it if you have a contractual clause, that will help you. If you don't have it, chances are the law won't come and rescue you. and that also, takes you to a point of understanding your power dynamics with your consumers and your customers, and how far you can go in terms of protecting yourself. But for sure, the successful ones are folks that looked at all these things in detail. Obviously, I'm sure you'll have great operations, great manufacturing, but as I said, looking at your contractual arrangements, your insurance coverage, understanding that you are set to do business in a country which is also litigious. That shouldn't be you shouldn't be afraid of that. But you need to get organized, right? It's like you're going, in a hike, and you need to have all the various components to make sure that your hike will be safe and enjoyable. Same thing to the US, for the US. Others that didn't go that well are folks that didn't plan ahead. And I think the biggest challenge was delaying. And I'm not saying this because we all want you guys to invest in the United States, but it's the truth. It's delaying an investment in terms of moving it to the manufacturing level as far as possible. It depends on the business models, but some, for example, we have a client that for 10 years has been, thinking, shall I do it? Shall I do it in terms of building a manufacturing facility in the United States? And now, because of the particular sector and where they are, they're at a complete disadvantage for not having done that earlier on. So I think the US, the lessons there is plan, study, understand, but then be bold. Don't half do it. Half doing it sometimes doesn't work. And that's what I see. That's what I see a lot now. Before, you had this cyclical tendency of, you start with an agency or distribution in the United States, then you ramp up to a subsidiary with your, a captive distribution subsidiary, then you ramp up to, light manufacturing, and then you finally close the circle with full manufacturing, and maybe through a joint venture acquisition or a greenfield project. I see a tendency to skip a lot of those, steps, but that has to be done with a fair bit of attention to detail and studying and understanding that what maybe works in your home jurisdiction doesn't necessarily work in the US, and that the US is very different. East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, they're different regions. That's my lesson.
Thank you. And Nicolette, could you share some common pitfalls companies run into?
I think that aligns quite well with what I was thinking, because I feel as if oftentimes some will move very quickly from why the US to immediately which state should I go to without having the operational plan in place. And it's hard to really decide which state or states you should focus on if you're not clear yet on what those requirements will be, or what type of facility you want to start with or even scale up to. So I think making sure that you have a very clear understanding around what your operations will look like, even the long-term plan for it, is going to be key in helping decide where is going to be the most optimal to help you into that long-term strategy. And then also having those clear requirements so that when you're evaluating different locations, you have a structured methodology to be able to evaluate for what you need. Because oftentimes, well, there's not going to be a perfect site. It's highly unlikely you find like a perfect kind of unicorn site. There's going to likely be trade-offs. So you'll get to a point where you have to make a decision on which trade-offs will allow you to still operate successfully for the long term. But it's going to be very difficult to make a decision between those trade-offs if there's not clarity around how they ultimately will impact your operation. So having that clear foundation before you start to narrow down too quickly is going to be important as you move through the overall process.
All right. Understood. Maybe for Amanda, looking ahead to the midterm elections, you already mentioned them. What should international companies be watching?
Yeah.
And how should they distinguish between, let's say, political noise and development that could really materially affect their investment decision?
That's a great question. I think there is a great deal of noise, and we need to separate that noise from the real risk. And part of that is understanding that what is said in Washington cannot always be implemented. That there are checks, and there are checks from voters, but there are also checks from courts, and sometimes it is more rhetoric than law. So we need to look at whether an initiative can pass or if it's just messaging. I think that you will find that most Americans are pretty moderate, reasonable people who like a steady path for us and for our international partners and want an environment that is inviting to international partners and international investment. And I think that's mostly what we're going to see going forward, no matter who controls the Congress. And just know that that it's not just about sort of a one or two vote majority in the House or Senate. Can lead to even more gridlock, and that's not a bad thing. I am a former Senate staffer married to a former House staffer, and he's a Republican. I'm a Democrat. We've been married for 26 years, and we always joke that he says the Senate is like a roadblock and makes things slow, and I say the House, they do things so quickly they don't even think about it. And really, that's the beauty of the way our government was set up in the United States, that there are great, great checks and balances. So we've already seen those come into play. We'll continue to see those come into play. Control of committees can impact oversight hearings and regulatory pressures on sectors. So that's something that I'm always looking out for my clients. I think, a lot of our trade policy is largely bipartisan and durable, like interest in supply chain, watching out for China. But really, the bottom line here is that it can look very, very volatile here, but a lot of the policies that maybe will matter most to you are very stable and harder to change than they appear. And, for the past 25 years, I have been working with federal dollars to make sure people are getting federal dollars, whether it's, a company for expansion, whether it's a community to purchase an important technology. And there hasn't been a day under these many jurisdictions with switching control of the House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats, where there hasn't been a great deal of federal resources available. So the things that I think may matter most to you are more stable than you would even imagine.
That's reassuring, at least, Amanda.
Agree.
Back to Nicolette. What are there any practical steps companies can take to, let's say, early on to reduce risk, even before they bring in full outside counsel or advisors?
Yeah, I think again, just having a very clear understanding around what your different requirements are going to be from a location is going to be critical before you start to look for physical properties. I think for us, we always think about this as it's not just a real estate transaction that is happening. It's really a long-term strategy that has to be considered. So pulling in all of the different components is going to be critical before you finalize a location. And then also just making sure you have a structured process with a methodology that's going to allow you to evaluate on an equal playing field across not only the states, but local jurisdictions as well. because I do think it's very important to make the distinction between evaluating states and evaluating local jurisdictions, because really up to 80% of your operating costs can be tied to your specific site location. So having a methodology that allows you to equally compare across the field is going to be critical. And then also just taking into account all of those different risk factors to ensure there's resiliency in the plan, flexibility for you to be able to operate. And then I also just have to add making sure you build out a realistic timeline. So if you're moving very quickly, it's definitely possible to find a location, but you also have to take into account all of the different timelines that may be involved before you can actually start producing. So really just looking at all of those different areas for consideration when it comes to not only the site, but going through the permitting processes, the ability to scale up workforce, all of that needs to be factored in across each local jurisdiction.
What is the bandwidth? What do you see? And I know that differs a lot probably per company and type of company and type of operation, but what do you see in general in terms of timeline?
It does really, I feel, depend on the type of company. You can certainly start to look at an existing building, but there's going to be considerations around upfitting that building if you have a very, unique structure for your manufacturing process. And most buildings will need some of that upfit anyway. So there's going to be the timeline involved in making those upfits. If you are considering a facility that has a high threshold for air pollutants, you have to go through the air permitting process. If it's considered a major permit, then that can be a minimum of 12 months. So it really does vary. I would say based on the scale of the operation, also the community you're locating in and what their timelines look like. And then also factoring in if you are getting any incentives for your location, there's going to be approval timelines based on that specific local jurisdiction, which can impact when you can start to do construction just because of the different rules around but for clauses. So, but for these incentives, you would not locate in this area. So that also has to be factored into the overall timeline.
So thank you for that. And we have 2 minutes left. So maybe a few takeaways from all of you. Gabriel, maybe from you, what should companies start doing tomorrow if they are serious about US expansion?
Hire a good lawyer. No, I'm kidding. Actually, a bad lawyer can be very dangerous. No, for sure, as I said, the legal piece is very important. You got to plan it, but you got to start with your business, right? Understand your business and how that fits within the US consumer base, whether it's B2B, B2C, and understand research and plan ahead. The ones that are successful are the ones that planned ahead, but and then go for it.
All right. Nicolette?
I'm going to say leverage your resources. I think certainly there are a lot of companies that can identify, for instance, the state or site, but having additional support throughout the process to help with some of these different nuances, like Amanda mentioned with the messaging or identifying risk in the timeline for getting the electric infrastructure in place or knowing how to navigate the local jurisdiction approval processes. All of that can ultimately impact your ability to get up and running. So I would say definitely if you are kind of moving through the process alone, leverage the resources that are out there to make sure you have a very defendable data-backed business case on why you chose a specific location, and it removes out the doubt of whether or not you're going to be able to operate there for the long term.
Thank you. And then the final seconds for you, Amanda.
Sure. I would just take some time to make sure that you understand sort of the business, the cultural, and the political environment that you are entering. And with the help of great consultants, you can do that. I think it's very important that you walk into the United States with that message about how you fit into not only, a business case for coming to the United States, but how the work that you're doing is going to enhance that community, enhance our country's supply chains, enhance the ability to do Build America, Buy America. I think there are a lot of considerations, and make sure you have your head around all of them before you come to the United States.
Wonderful. So the US remains a major opportunity for European companies, but success depends on approaching expansion with much more precision, strategically, operationally, politically, and in the words of Gabriel, apply a global strategy. Expansion, meaning in order to be globally successful, you need to be locally present. Thank you to our experts on the call, Nicolette, Amanda, Gabriel, and also thank you to our audience for listening. Sign up for our newsletter if you want to stay informed about our future programs that can be done through our website. And I'm looking forward to seeing you next time, virtually or in person. Have a nice day, all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.